Welcome. It's an honor to be here with Jonathan Lethem, one of our most respected and important writers, author of 11 novels and numerous other writings across various publications, and also teaching creative writing now at nearby Pomona. Before we get into the book, the most recent novel, I wanted to start more with your own background.
Sure.
Your father was an artist, your mother was a political activist, and I know you lost your mother at an early age. I think you were 13.
My mother died when I was 14, but she'd been ill for a few years. So her cancer in my childhood was a big feature of growing up. But I did know her, and she was a dynamic personality and a big part of my life anyway.
Can you talk a bit about how those early family years have influenced your writing career?
Oh well, yeah. I mean, I'm so much a product of my parents, but everyone is. My father grew up in the Midwest, and he was kind of a black sheep of a big Protestant farming family. He grew up in Iowa and Missouri, and all of his many brothers and sisters stayed in the Midwest and had big families and went into business of various kinds. And he ran away to New York and Paris and became a painter, and had all sorts of bohemian misadventures, and ended up teaching painting at Columbia University, where he met my mother, who was from an entirely other world. She was a second-generation Eastern European Jewish immigrant, and from an immigrant family, and was a kind of really a New Yorker in a deep sense. She was grew up in Queens and was a public school kid, and ran away from college in the middle of her college years to be part of the folk scene in Greenwich Village, and never looked back. And so they met in the early days of the New York counterculture. She was, piercing ears on McDougal Street, and he was a painter who was also doing shelving to support himself. And that's my world. I write about it, and I grew up in that tradition of bohemianism, arts. I was a painter when I was a kid. I thought I was going to follow my father's footsteps exactly, and I went to music and art high school in New York. So I was also and I grew up in Brooklyn, so I was also a New York, outer borough New York kid. Of course, Brooklyn's a very fashionable address now, but back then it was still, Manhattan was the gleaming tower, and all the other quadrants were very marginal.
And like most great geniuses, you're also a college dropout.
And I dropped out of college, followed in my mother's footsteps that way. And many years later, I had the peculiar experience of being sort of rescued by academia, because I was a sophomore on leave from Bennington College into my late 40s. And then in 1 year, in one calendar year, I was given 2 honorary doctorates and offered a very unique job at Pomona College, which brought with it instant full professorship and tenure. So I went from being a sophomore on leave to being a professor with a full professor with tenure and 2 doctorates. I recommend this to everyone. But I mostly have taken on my parents' legacy of, I guess I would call it anti-institutionalism. I'm kind of a lifelong runaway from conventional systems. For example, most of the writers I know my age have MFA degrees. It was very ordinary. I somehow missed that memo in a way. I didn't even realize that I was depriving myself of this experience, but I did what I thought was the way you become a writer, and I think in some earlier generations it was, and I was modeling myself on those earlier generations. I went and worked in a bookstore as a clerk, and I was just writing my first few novels and living in this case in the Bay Area, in Berkeley and Oakland, and working in used bookstores. And I thought that was the kind of apprenticeship that I should have. So I've now been sort of domesticated in a certain sense by Pomona College, and I actually have a day job. But there's a funny thing about my appearing in the Disney room, which I should describe for you, because the chair I occupy at Pomona College, this very nice endowed position that they pulled me into, is called the Roy E. Disney apostrophe 51 chair in creative writing. It was Walt Disney's brother, who was his partner, business partner, not on the creative side, but on the business side, and who was a Pomona alum and who left this remarkable endowment to bring a novelist to Pomona College. So I come to you bearing the Disney imprimatur.
It's fate. Well, the Huffington Post review of The Feral Detective described it in part as genre bending, and that is a concept and even an exact phrase that I know you have discussed in interviews even years prior to this novel. And it's interesting when we get the question from an agent or from a publisher, who is this book for? You know, who's going to read this book? And the answer for that question for somebody like John Grisham is very simple. This book is for people who enjoy legal thrillers. And for you, that is Grisham's lane. And for you, there isn't an exact lane so much like that. How
Certainly
much
not
do you
like
think,
that, yeah.
How do you think, or how much do you think about existing in multiple lanes or bending lanes in your writing?
Well, I'm very interested in them. I don't like to pretend that this world of what you're calling lanes or genres doesn't exist. I think it's incredibly rich that writing takes form, in many cases, according to these expectations, these sort of rule books or systems, And when I was a kid, I had some genres I was really responsive to. I would go to the library and there was a spinner rack of paperback science fiction novels, pocket-sized paperback science fiction novels, and I wanted to read every book on that spinner rack. They had a certain kind of energy and brightness and ideas and weirdness that I just really loved. So I thought, I like science fiction. And I also identified very strongly with detective stories. And I discovered Raymond Chandler on my mother's bookshelves, actually, and then sought other things like that. And so I was really into a certain kind of what I thought of as the hard-boiled detective story. And when I started out writing, I wanted to do some of those things. I wanted to do them, but I didn't want to do them in an obedient or orderly way because I always wanted to do multiple things at the same time. And my first novel actually was a cross, a kind of a splice between a hard-boiled detective story and what now is called commonly a dystopian science fiction. The word wasn't as well circulated then as it is now. But I was very into dystopian science fiction. I mean, we associate this with Orwell and 1984 and Huxley and certain writers that I really revered, like J.G. Ballard and Philip K. Dick. And I emulated this stuff shamelessly. So I was engaging with genre, but multiple genres. It wasn't that I was avoiding those labels. It was that I wanted them all to stick to me somehow. And this created a lot of confusion for my publisher, and I think maybe in a weird way it became a useful confusion because they decided not to put any name on the book. They just decided to see what happened. And what happened with that first novel was that crime reviewers and readers and specialty bookstores that liked crime fiction celebrated it. And the science fiction genre also celebrated it. It was nominated for a Nebula Award, and I was sort of welcomed into the very gregarious world of science fiction, which is a very social realm, lots of conventions and gatherings. And I just said yes to all of this. I didn't hold it at bay. And as I learned about more things through my reading that I loved to do and had the ambition to do, I would add those in. So my next novels continued to create this sort of, in my mind, I think, exciting confusion because they would be doing more than one thing at a time. It was like I was, that old vaudeville thing called the plate spinning act? I would put a broomstick up and I would get one plate spinning and then I'd run over here and spin this other one and then I'd run back and keep this one spinning. I was like, look, it's all at once. Yeah. That seemed to me the most exciting thing I could do. And so I just kept the confusion alive. So by my fourth novel, I'd written a book that was a Western set on Mars. And then I wrote a neurological detective story. And then I wrote a book that was a coming-of-age novel, in some ways a very traditional kind of novel, what they call a Bildungsroman, right? The thinly disguised childhood of the author. But I also put magic realism and superheroes with real powers into that book. So I was always trying to smash things together and keep them all working at once, like the plate spinner in the vaudeville show.
Well, I admire it, and it's great that you've been able to break through with that because, you know, in these publishing houses, they all have a sales team that needs to go out and talk to 1,000 independents and talk to Barnes & Noble and say, here's this book. They're going to explain it to you and sell it to you, and they must be like, oh, great, we've got another Lethem. How do we even talk about this thing to the bookstores? So
let me clear it up. By the way, it's already been said 3 different ways. It's Lethem.
Lethem.
Everybody say it with me. Lethem. There you go.
The novel has an allegorical message to it. You've got the two-party system with the rabbits and the bears, and I know your work on the book straddled the 2016 election. Did you set out at first to write a political allegory, or did components of that really emerge in the process?
It was a book I'd been planning for a couple of years already, and I had a thought about, so I've written about detectives twice before. This first novel that I mentioned to you, and Motherless Brooklyn. So I had 2 detective stories. I'd sort of done one in each decade of my writing life to that point. And I sort of thought, I'm ready to do another detective. And at the same time, I was thinking a lot, because I was teaching a course at Pomona about animals and literature. And within the animals and literature course, I started to realize there was an area that I was particularly interested in, and that was the child raised by animals, the feral character. We all know this image, whether we think of it or not. We know it from Tarzan and Mowgli. But then there are also, other slightly darker examples. There's the famous German boy named Caspar Hauser, who wandered in out of the woods. And I thought, this image of the feral child raised by animals and then functioning in human civilization is very interesting to me. What if I made a detective in a mystery story who had been a feral child? And this idea seemed very rich to me, intriguing. I didn't know what I meant by it, but I could tell that it had the kind of energy that I liked and that would be useful for me to try to build on. And I was planning this book and working on it in my mind and taking a few notes. And I didn't know when it would be set. I'd begun to decide it would be set in the desert. So, I'd been spending a lot of time in Joshua Tree in particular, and Anderson Valley, and I decided my feral detective would be from the desert, and that would be the space of the book. But I had no notion of making it be about contemporary political life. I was just setting out to write a book that I thought would be a perfectly good novel to write during the Hillary Clinton administration. And then it was right as it was time for me to begin writing, that it was November 2016. And I woke up after that election in a space that just didn't feel familiar to me. A lot of my certainties just seemed toppled, and like a lot of people I knew, what I did day to day looked different and harder to do. Like, the world didn't make the same sense that it had to me. And I thought, am I supposed to change what I do or respond to this in some way, or am I supposed to stop? Are novels meaningless in this environment? And of course, that's not right. If you're a plumber, you should go and fix toilets in that situation. And if I'm a writer, I should write a novel. And hey, I remembered, I have this novel I'm excited about. Let me go back and write it. But it didn't seem to look the same to me. It seemed to me that it didn't have the immediacy of my experience. So I decided to put the book on sort of fast forward and start writing it exactly set at the time that I was living through. So by the time I organized my materials, it was January, and the book is set in the 5 days before and the 5 days after Trump's inauguration. So that all the images and all the ideas that I was already working with suddenly became a kind of picture of that moment. And so the book has a double reality to it for me. It's in a way, it's a series of like putting your finger to the air and just being like, what does it feel like now? Can I put that on the page? I wanted to capture the kind of destabilization and the kind of discomfort that seemed typical of that time.
I'll stay away from any spoilers, but I wanted to point to one line that I loved. On page 166, Phoebe, our protagonist, says of the rabbits, who is one of these desert groups, they were survivors of a catastrophe that hadn't happened yet. And I love that line. Can you describe what she means with regard to the rabbits and any connection to our real world outside the novel?
Well, so another thing this book became about, and I think this was inevitable and stands a little bit apart from the selection context that we were just describing, is that to write about the desert, but really to write about the present in any environmental space, is to write about climate change and the anxieties surrounding our environmental space, the way that's a kind of moving target. Out here, of course, you think about water and scarcity. You think about temperature. But everywhere. I spend summers in coastal Maine where, the snow doesn't fall in the same way, and the things people grow in the summer months when it's a growing season have changed, and the time has moved when the tomatoes will come up, and everyone knows it. Everyone in their bodies and in their real environments, whatever their kind of political opinion about this, people are feeling it, and I wanted to also write about that. And one of the things that seemed interesting to me about the desert that I started to like and be drawn to even before I could consciously articulate it was that a lot of people out in those spaces, who've gone there for distance from quote unquote civilization, out in Joshua Tree and some of those other towns that are even more scattered and dispersed, they have the air of being survivors out on a kind of periphery. They've staked out a space. They have to truck water into where they live. They need jeeps because they're driving on dirt roads. And I began to think about this idea of the preparations for catastrophe or for radical change in the environment. And I just thought, one of the things that interests me is that, what's happened in the last few years is that some of the craziest people you knew, the ones who were like peak oil people or preparing a bomb shelter, now seem like they might have been ahead of you. They might have been the right ones. And so this group, the rabbits, in a way, when she sees them and she has that thought, it's me having that thought all at once, like, what if they're right? Mm-hmm. They're survivors of a catastrophe that I don't realize either is about to happen or has already happened, and I haven't caught up to it.
Mm-hmm. Toward the end of the book, Phoebe, again our protagonist, says that we should do away with the two-party system, that it should be blown up. And Heist has sort of a foot in each of the parties. He's really a product of both the rabbits and the bears. Is there a hopeful or unifying message in the character Heist?
Well, I don't know. I might be... I always want to suggest that my book has a hopeful... Any of my books have a hopeful element to them. But, Heist, so he's the detective who grew up as, in that way, like Mowgli or Tarzan. He grew up as a feral creature. He has, and he does, as you say, he sort of straddles these two worlds, the kind of very crude, nomadic, masculine tribe of the bears, who were, it's kind of like somewhere between Robert Bly figures, but also like a biker gang. And then the rabbits are trying to integrate in their environment, and they're kind of huddled in warrens, and they're very dependent on each other, and they're obviously more feminized kind of image. He was raised in the breach between these two groups. What he does as a result and as a response is individual rescue and retrieval. He doesn't try to solve the system. He just goes in and takes children out. He sees the system as so nightmarish, to be trapped between these poles and to try to live in that world of unbearable extremes and irreconcilable conflicts. He just identifies figures of compassionate need, and he salvages them. He pulls them out of the nightmare. For him personally, he was elected king of the bears, and he kind of abdicates. And we have this right now in our world, right? We have like royalty that doesn't want to be royalty. So he was meant to be the big bear, and he said no, thank you. And in a way, and it took me writing the whole book to really feel this about him. He's not a figure of resolution, or he hasn't really solved any of this for himself. He's almost like a Bartleby the Scrivener. He's just that character who says, no, thank you. I decline. I would prefer not to. And in the meantime, I'm going to help individual people in distress.
I'd like to shift gears for 1 minute and talk about Motherless Brooklyn,
Sure.
your earlier terrific novel. I read when it first came out and loved it. It has recently been on the big screen. Mm-hmm. It was a passion project of Edward Norton. It involved Willem Dafoe and Alec Baldwin, Bruce Willis, and others. I know the film made some departures from the novel, but can you tell us about your experience with the film project?
Sure. Well, I mean, it was a very long relationship and a very tangential one in some ways. I wrote that book in 1997 and 98. It was published in 1999. That same year, actually when it was in galleys, before it had even come out, Edward Norton and his producing partners swept it up. And at that time, he was on the top of the charts. Fight Club and American History X had come out, and everyone would want to work with this person. So he had a lot of power to initiate a project, and everyone was really excited that he'd picked up the book. The part of the main character seemed perfect for him to play. And I agreed, and I thought that was great. And also, they wrote me a great big check. And I met him a couple of times then and really enjoyed talking with him. I thought he was, he had really apt and interesting insights into the book. And he surprised me, and I think surprised some of his team by deciding he wanted to both write and direct the film himself. But I thought, great, I don't have to do that. And so I just wished him well, and I used the money to buy that farmhouse in Maine that I've been going to for 20 years. So that was already a happy ending in 1999. I didn't need there to be a movie. But every now and then I would get a call from Edward directly or his agents a couple of times saying, we're still working on this, and or here's an update, or Bruce Willis has agreed to be in it, and we're about to shoot, and then it was a couple of false alarms, and they didn't, and suddenly 20 years had gone by.
Wow.
And now there's a movie. But I still am in the disbelief phase. Even though I went to the movie, I saw it 3 times, I've become so accustomed to it being just an idea of something that would happen that I really don't believe that it was a movie. So, But no, when I saw it, I liked it. I had fun. It's really different from the book in a lot of ways, which makes sense to me. It's, film and a novel, they're such different operations. And that book is it has a lot of colorful elements in it, but it's very much made of language, and it's very much inside the character's head. There would be no way to film it unless you made a very avant-garde film that you could say was faithful.
Are you ever tempted to write the film version of any of your books, or do you feel like, look, I've imagined it this way, I can't reimagine it another way in this other format?
It's one reason my books are all so different from each other, is that I get very, you could call it satisfied, or you call it restless or impatient. I don't want to stay in those places. When I bring it to what feels completion to me, I want to hand it off and be done. So if I were to write a film, I'd want to write something else entirely, not rewrite one of my books.
And would you do that?
I've fooled around with it a little bit. I've been invited into that situation a few times. Always interesting and gratifying. I don't think I'm the greatest at it, but even more than that, I have something else I like to do so much better, which is just write novels. I want to leave behind a shelf of, one after the next, and I'm very, very blessed that people care and that you guys are here listening to me. It's amazing to me. I still wake up and I can't believe that I'm in this situation where the weird ideas that I have in my head, like this one, are published and people want to read them. And so I'm in an ideal state writing a novel, and I just want to keep doing that.
That's great. You mentioned Dick as one of your influences. I know you're a fan of Tolkien. You're a big fan of Bob Dylan. Any other big influences or contemporary writers?
There's so many things that I feed into my, that I care about, and they're reflected in my work. Other writers, Don DeLillo, people who are here, George Saunders and Michael Chabon are inspirations to me. And yes, other mediums. I'm a big film goer. Despite my feeling that I'm not really that great at writing screenplays, I really care about film and think about it hard. Growing up watching Stanley Kubrick films or Truffaut, Hitchcock, those to me are as deep an influence on my ideas about storytelling and characters as any novel. So they're very intimate influences on my work.
So one more question for me, and then we'll open it up to some audience questions, so you can get yours ready. But you alluded to it a bit. Your career has been discussed as broadly, bending these genres within the novel. But really, you are working with the novel, short stories. You've worked on Marvel superheroes, music, the visual arts. So you're really bending genres in a much broader sense. To say you're bending genres in the novel is almost not enough. You're doing other things.
Well, those things are almost always, they seem surprising to me when I do them, because I feel so centered in this practice of writing a novel, and I'm always working on a novel. But my enthusiasms, in a way, have made their claim on me. I wrote and talked so enthusiastically about rock and roll that I sort of got pulled into the experience of being a music journalist for a little while, and I spent a week in the recording studio with James Brown and wrote a big piece about that. I never expected to do that. It wasn't an ambition for me. Marvel Comics came and got me, and they were like, "Why don't you write a comic for us?" And I'd grown up reading them, and I couldn't say no. So I wrote 10 issues of a comic book. But these things always seem to me like they're weird gifts that fall into my lap, and they're not what I programmed for myself. It wasn't like I thought, let me try to do all these other activities. Even essay writing and book reviewing, I'm surprised when I see that I've written enough book reviews that you could have a compendium of them, and now I've got 2 books of my essays and nonfiction. That was never my assignment to myself. I always just thought, write another novel. But
can you tell us a bit about what you're working on now?
Sure. I'm just finishing a new novel that will be published in late November, so within the year. It's called The Arrest, and it's as different, again, from Feral Detective as could be possible. This one's set in the desert West and is about a detective. The new one, The Arrest, is set in Maine, in coastal Maine, in a very near future after a kind of gentle post-industrial collapse. It's like an almost pastoral disaster novel. The cell phones and the cars and the guns just stop working, and everyone has to just shrug. And so it's a world in which the organic farmers are the top of the heap because they're feeding everyone.
Got the preppers. That's the way to go.
Yeah.
So we can take a few from the audience. Any questions for Jonathan? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, would you say something about how gender functions with the rabbit?
Oh, sure, of course, yes.
The question is about how gender functions with the rabbits.
Yeah, it's very much a book about male and female in a lot of ways. And, so there's so many different ways that you can describe a novel. It's a container with a lot in it, right? I talked about my fascination with the idea of what if a detective had grown up as a feral child. But the other thing I thought about was the classical pattern of the hard-boiled detective story. It's always told by the detective. It's a man's world. And that detective tends to be a kind of someone who's had his heart crushed by a woman at some point. I mean, if we think about the Raymond Chandler, Humphrey Bogart character, and when the woman walks into his office, she's alluring but untrustworthy. She also doesn't have a lot to do in the story. He basically says, "Okay, I'll go take the job," and then she goes and disappears. And I thought, what if I reversed the polarity on the hard-boiled detective story, and I followed the woman's voice? She was telling the story. She walks into his office, and you stay on her. And you wonder where the detective went. So I had this really interesting response, which was like, it seemed like such an obvious idea, and I couldn't find any examples of anyone who'd done it. Write it from the point of view of the client in the story. Faye Dunaway instead of Jack Nicholson, and then, as I said, the election happened, and suddenly the whole world seemed to be about gender. And I thought, okay, so she's going to be angry in the way that women feel angry right now, because that's how I'm going to identify with her. I'm going to use that energy and build her personality partly around this sense of injury. And so she looks at a lot of the people around her, including the detective, on those terms. So it became, my completely unauthorized, feminist tract, I guess.
Yes, sir.
When I read Motherless Brooklyn, I assumed that you were an Easterner. How did it come to be that who approached you to go to Pomona?
Yes, right. Why am I such a Californian? Yeah.
The question is, how did we get from the East Coast to the West Coast as settings?
Well, there's two different parts of my life where I run away from New York City. It's a weird kind of, you live long enough and you repeat things. When I first, I was growing up in Brooklyn, and that world of Motherless Brooklyn and of a subsequent novel called The Fortress of Solitude is very much a depiction of my native turf, public school kid in Brooklyn when Brooklyn was still a tough place to be from as opposed to being a brand name. And I wanted to get out. New York in the 70s was hard in some ways. I was very much a creature of it. I still sound like a kid from Brooklyn, I think. But I wanted to get out. So I went to college in Vermont. And then when I left college, prematurely, as I described, I didn't want to go back to New York. I ran away from the East Coast entirely to the Bay Area. And that's when I worked in used bookstores in Berkeley for a while. And that's where I started my life as an adult and as a writer. I was teaching myself to write and living very happily in the Bay Area. Then I wrote about New York and moved back there, and I had this triumphant phase of being the New York writer living in New York. It was like the kid makes good. I was the returning, Brooklyn kid, and everything I did seemed to be so Brooklyn-oriented. But in fact, I was actually kind of anxious there in some ways. There were things about New York that was changing. The gentrification bummed me out, and it was a hard place for me to write. I often found myself seeking hiding places, like going to artist colonies in New England to write. And that's when Edward Norton blessed me with enough money to buy the farmhouse in Maine. And I was, just around the time Pomona College called, I was flirting with living in Maine instead, actually. I was kind of thinking of leaving the city anyway. And then the Disney chair. Okay, so I'll try California again. I've never lived in Southern California. So I gave it a shot. And I've kind of fallen in love with the desert. It worked out, and I've written a whole book about the desert, so, yeah.
Has the time spent teaching gotten in the way of your time for writing?
Well, people ask that, and I always think, it isn't as if I was only writing before. Writers, you know this, writers are always doing writing and something. And when I was in my 20s, it was writing and going out dancing, taking drugs, and working in a used bookstore. When I was in my 30s and I was childless and I had lots of energy, it was writing and doing lots of journalism, like the rock and roll, interviewing Bob Dylan and James Brown and taking a million little weird gigs and doing a couple of little screenplays. It was always writing and. Partly because, well, it's usually two reasons. You need money from something else. Mm-hmm. You're not paid enough just writing books, usually, if you're me. But also, you can't write only. Your life is way too cloistered if you do that. You need other contacts. You need to move and be in the world in some way. So now in my middle life, I have young kids. It doesn't make sense for me to travel as much. So the teaching is a blessing. My writing and is very organized. I go 2 days a week and I talk to young writing students, brilliant students, because Pomona is a great college. And yeah, sometimes I wish I was writing instead, but I need that other thing too. I need contact.
It's funny you say that. I used to run a software company before I became a full-time writer.
Yeah.
And so I was writing the first draft of my first novel while I was running around on planes. And I'd be like, all right, I got a 4-hour flight. And nothing would bring things into focus quite like having that kind of window that you'd had to operate within. Yes, sir.
What
What's your favorite Bob Dylan album?
Ooh, one album. That's tough. I mean, I love the traditionally revered great ones. You know, I think I'd probably say Blonde on Blonde, but I'm very tempted because of my relationship to Bob Dylan to be utterly perverse and say, Infidels, except the one that he didn't release. You know, Infidels with all those extra songs on it. If he'd made the right Infidels, it would have been the greatest album he'd ever made. I don't know. You know, I really love him in a lot of different phases of his career. But I will probably admit that the traditional summits are, for me, also the Blonde on Blonde, Blood on the Tracks. Yeah.
Are you part of the movie that's being made on Bob Dylan's life?
Sorry,
Well-
question is, are you part of
yeah.
the movie that's being made on Bob Dylan?
There's a current biopic in the works, is that right? I have nothing to do with that. I've never had to do anything to do with any of the documentaries or films. I interviewed him once for Rolling Stone, and I get caught up in the world of what they call Dylanology sometimes. I get interviewed about him as if I'm some sort of expert on him just because I drop his name everywhere. So I think I'm an academic in my relationship to Dylan, rather than being involved in like the movie world of his. I mean, he's so like when he won the Nobel, lots of people came to me for comment, as if I could like set that straight for them, like whether that was a good or bad idea, you know. So in the kind of the world of the study of Bob Dylan, I get pulled into that a bit. Yeah.
In the back, ma'am?
Are there any nibbles for Fortress to become a movie?
Oh gosh, there have been so many. I have this, until Motherless Brooklyn kind of ruined this description by actually being made. I had this remarkable status, which I really kind of learned to love, which was I was the most developed, least filmed author ever. There was a point where I had 8 different novels in a development process with different directors attached, and I think now a couple of them have fallen out. I think I have 4 or 5 that are, so they made Motherless Brooklyn, a couple of others have stopped, but there are several that are in progress, or I mean in a development process. And it was kind of great. It meant people were always talking about my books as possible movies, but they were never having actual movies to be disappointed by. Fortress has had 3 different development histories. Darren Aronofsky was going to make it at one point, and that didn't happen. But it would have been neat because he's a Brooklyn kid too, so he would have identified with it really directly. And then there was a point at which Brad Pitt's production company had control of it, and there was another project. But that is an exception in one way, in that it also was developed, but not for film. There was a stage version of it, and that did happen. It was an off-Broadway musical of Fortress of Solitude that I thought was fantastic, and that many people who know much more than I do about musical theater still celebrated.
It did not buy a house in Maine, however.
No, but it was an unbelievably gratifying thing to have happen, and the score, the original songs, still exist and are you can listen to it on.
Did you write any of that? Any of the
Nothing
music
to do
for
with
it?
that. I would
Nothing.
be even less qualified to write a musical than because I don't think in those terms. No, it was just a gift to me because it was suddenly I saw my childhood, to some extent, because that book is in a sense my childhood, turned into songs on a stage. It was almost unbearably moving to me. You can hear me choking up now just remembering it. So that was a great experience. Yeah. I recommend. I think you can go to streaming services and hear the original cast recording of it, and it's very good.
Other questions for Jonathan?
Anything you can ask me about Bob Dylan. I'll try to.
Would you ever teach one of your own novels at Pomona?
No, I just don't see that as having any positive outcome. I mean, if they love it, you're being a total jerk. You're a self-aggrandizing jerk, and the other possibility is much worse even than that, right? Mm-hmm. No, what would it? It seems treacherous and vain and impossible. Yeah.
What are you teaching there now?
I'm teaching this semester. I'm teaching Kafka's The Castle, Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook, and Samuel Delaney's Dahlgren. Lots of pages. I'm keeping them very busy reading. But it's fun.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Jonathan's going to be
Yeah.
signing books.
Thanks
very much.
Thanks, everyone.